Hi, my name's Lisa Garrett, and I'm going to be speaking to you today on how we can improve teachers' pedagogies to work effectively with culturally diverse learners, and more specifically refugee students with a refugee background through cultural competency professional learning. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the Gimoi Wallaba Yidinji and the Yirakanji people as the traditional custodians on the land in which I'm speaking to you today. I would like to pay respects to elders past, present, and future. So just a little bit about myself. I'm currently the Principal Project Officer for Indigenous EALD for the Division of First Nations Partnerships and Strategies in the Education Department in Queensland. Prior to that, I've worked in various EALD roles. I have about 20 plus years of teaching EAL, both in the Indigenous EAL space and migrant refugee space. Prior to this role I'm in now, I was the EAL coordinator for an intensive English centre in Cairns. Before we start on this journey, and I would probably say it's a journey today for some of you, it's Glenn Singleton in his book around having courageous conversations about race has these 4 agreements, and I always like to start my sessions using these. I think they're a really good way to monitor how our thinking and monitor some of our feelings and how we approach this work. So he always talks about that we always stay engaged, we speak our truth, and that we experience discomfort. And discomfort, it's really good. It's really important that we have this cognitive dissonance. Without this cognitive dissonance, we can't learn. We're not going to shift the way we do things and our practice. And that sometimes that we can expect and accept non-disclosure. So it's okay if this session today doesn't really bring closure for you. It may actually create more questions and may create more of a gap of the unknowing or unknown. I've got 2 provocations I want to sort of have in the back of your mind when we are doing this work today. And that's just looking at these 2, thinking about what you know about the Australian education system and the basis of which is formed. So what are the values that Australian education is underpinned by? And also to think about the intentions that sit behind. What are the intentions of the system? And what are the intentions of the policies and the practices from those policies? You know, so also I maybe to also consider your context. That's what are some of the stereotypes and biases that sit behind the system? How does that impact the policies that you have to enact? And how does that impact your practice as an EAL teacher? Does that create challenges for you, frustration, or does it help you to do the work that you do? I also want you to consider this dominant narrative and discourse that we've been told in Australia for over a period of time. And, you know, and often this supports and defends these inequities, and also defends and supports even our own biases about ourselves and others. and sometimes this goes unchecked. So I want you to think about how some of this narrative is impacted or influenced into the education space that you work in, or that you've worked in prior to the role that you're in now. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this a little bit more as we go into the session. Also, I want you to consider for a moment that dominant narrative. How does it influence your behaviours and practice currently in the work that you do as an EAL teacher? How does it influence teachers' expectations and relationships? Does it influence yours? Have you seen how it may impact teachers' expectations of students that you work with or that you have to support? And also I want you to think about, how do you think it feels as a First Nations person or someone from a refugee background or a migrant learner, that to know that this narrative is held about you or others? So you may be a First Nations person. How does it make you feel? How does it, if you're from a refugee background, how do you think it feels knowing that this narrative is held by you or others? So in today's session, we're just going to go through some of the theory that unpacks this research that I'm going to talk to you about, the problem, the research questions, give you a bit of background around the literature to give you some context, just talk about the methodology and design. But, you know, I really want to focus mainly on some of the findings and the outcomes of this research, and then look at some takeaways that perhaps we can take away to consider, to think about, or maybe to use and enact in your professional practice. So as stated before, this is a presentation on my doctoral research, which I completed about 18 months ago. And I've been asked today to share this with you. So I hope that there may be some gold nuggets in here that you can take away and implement or to consider. So let's get started. So let's look at this problem. So the research that I engaged in addresses these following problems. And from the literature and even my own professional practice, these were a problem that I identified. And as you can see, one of the major problems I identified was Standard 1.3 of the Australian Professional Teaching Standards, because this wasn't really widely understood. And in some cases, very little was there around to help teachers enact this or to really understand what that actually looks like in practice, and there's very little around to help teachers unpack it. So there was also very little professional learning to prepare teachers in the standard, and also very little to prepare teachers to work with the complex needs of students from refugee backgrounds, but also thinking about from a wider level, students from a range of culturally diverse backgrounds. Also from a whole school perspective and a system, particularly in the space where I was working, schools were very much not equipped to or prepared to cater to students with refugee backgrounds. Very little, even though that the area that I lived in, which is Cairns, had regional resettlement program for 20 years, there's still very little work around what that actually meant when it was filtered down to school level and classroom level. Also, finally, looking at teachers' attitudes and beliefs around the idea around their beliefs around refugees and migrants, I guess, on a broader scale, and Indigenous learners, and also thinking about how those actually impact their pedagogical choices, how they use those pedagogies in the classrooms. You know, did it have a negative impact on those students? And so if we look at my questions, you can see that there were two sets of questions I really wanted to unpack, which was looking at, can professional learning, or so this was a professional learning intervention. So with the focus on cultural competency and culturally responsive pedagogy, can it assist teachers to better enact 1.3 of the Australian Professional Teaching Standards? And can it impact and affect, can it change teachers' assumptions and beliefs about students from a refugee background? And I guess, you know, we can also think of that on a broader scale again, around culturally, not just students from a refugee background. While the study, it was more focused on of this particular group. I believe that it can be taken from in a broader sense, like students from culturally diverse backgrounds, migrants, Indigenous learners. So I actually needed to address these 4 areas that you can see in front of you and really unpack that and to address my problem. So there were 3 areas of that underpinned the theory of this research: critical social theory, social constructivism, and an ethics of care. So the study was actually influenced by my personal narrative around my background and my lived experience. So I'm a migrant. I am from a Māori and Pakeha background from New Zealand. I also have spent many years living abroad in a variety of cultural contexts, but also in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Australia. So this really impacted how I framed the study. So I drew on the work from Jaru and Freire, and they were really concerned about how educational institutions, they really positioned marginalized students. So, but they also saw that that it was really important, but to advocate for critically addressing cultural differences and powers that power relations in the classroom, in the school system, and I guess at a systems level. And they also talked about the role of the cultural broker as critical to addressing this cultural difference and addressing the power dynamics in the school context. And I'm going to go back into that in a minute. But what I also thought was really critical to the work to underpin my work was Nodding's notion of ethics of care. So she thinks that that this ethics of care is critical because it emphasizes the importance of relationships, reciprocity, and community. So those 3 things are really critical to help break down oppression. It helps to break down inequity in community, in the school context, and to deal with and address the power dynamics that occur in schools and in the system at a wider level. She also thinks and believes that, you know, in order to do that work that we do in the cross-cultural space, that it helps us to engage in self-reflection and, you know, and also to be aware that, you know, we're not, you know, we're all human. We're completely flawed, and we're always going to be prone to errors and our own biases because we draw always on our own social context and our own cultural context to view the world, and that through self-reflection we are able to, I guess, to be aware of those flaws that that we bring to the work that we do. So going back to a cultural broker, as an EAL teacher working cross-culturally for many years, I've always seen myself, as Jaru talks about, as this cultural broker. And what Gay talks about, I think, really fits nicely in, you know, the work that we do as EAL teachers, is that we are the ones who thoroughly understand cultural systems, and that we interpret these cultural systems from one frame to another. So we can, for many of us, that's quite an easy process to do. Sometimes it's hard, but, you know, and that we can actually mediate between these cultural incompatibilities, you know, between the dominant culture of Australia and these new migrants or new arrivals coming into the school environment. And we know how to build these bridges and make these linkages. And through doing that, we can really facilitate the instructional process, you know, and help to build capacity for teachers, build teacher capacity to make that happen. So I think that this is a really nice way to really describe the work that I was doing at the time when I was doing this research, because I was working as a classroom teacher in an EAL intensive English centre. So I had all students who were migrant and refugee background, and I was also coordinating the intensive English centre, and this really described the work that I did. So I really wanted to ensure that it influenced the way in which I enacted the research. So let's have a look at some literature that sort of underpins the study, and it'll give you some insight as to why, I guess, I focused on refugee education in my study. And, you know, we know that schools are critical for, play a really critical part in ensuring the success of students. You know, schools are, you know, Matthew talks about this as a stabilizing feature in an unsettled lives of refugees. So, and, you know, schools are the front line to the resettlement process. So when we think about, you know, new arrivals coming in, you know, the education system is one of those institutions that families have access to every day. For most families coming into Australia, the schools are the ones that they deal with every day. So it's really important, if this is the case, that we got to get it right, and we have to get it right the first time. And in some cases, we don't get it right. So it's really important to make sure that we help teachers and build their capacity, so when these young people come into their classrooms, they're getting it right. I know in my context, it might not be in your context, but for the context of the work that I was doing at that time, schools and teachers were not adequately equipped to provide support. There were no policies, there was no real curriculum. So it was much of a challenge. But also, there was also a real emphasis at that time on these standardized testings, and still is, and this homogenized curriculum. And there was a one-size-fits-all approach, and it's led to teacher intensification of teacher workload and constrained teacher practice. So, you know, this added to the greater marginalization of refugee learners and their learning needs. So when I was thinking about this research, it wasn't really focusing on the intensive English centre. It was really focusing on when those students go out into the mainstream classes. So students were coming to me for support through a withdrawal model. So up to 2 to 3 hours a day, depending on their timetable. But then the rest of the time, they were in their classrooms with their peers and a mainstream classroom teacher. So the work was very difficult for teachers who had very little experience working cross-culturally and found it very difficult. So when thinking about the literature around, well, how do we best then support teachers? What are the pedagogies that are going to be really important for helping teachers to teach culturally diverse classrooms, and more specifically for students with a refugee background? So I then had to think about, so then I thought, well, here's culturally responsive pedagogy, because that actually enables us to teach across many cultures. So I needed to think about what was going to be the most effective for teachers to use. So what is culturally responsive pedagogy? Well, I used, in my study, these next two definitions is what I used to base my understandings around. And that was that as teachers, we can use the cultural knowledge that comes into the classroom. We use the students' prior experiences and their frames of reference and their different performance styles, okay? And then using that, we make the learning encounters relevant and effective for them. So we use the toolkits or the kitty bag or the kitty that they come into the classroom with, and that is the resource that they bring with them, and we use that. Also, culturally responsive pedagogy is actually a conceptual framework that we can work in. So if we think of it more broadly as a framework that encompasses and that it promotes academic success, that's fundamentally the most important element of a culturally responsive pedagogy. And it also actually then also requires us to be culturally competent. Now, I use the word culturally competent because at the time when I began my research, that was I guess, the discourse that was using. But I will be using culturally responsiveness interchangeably. So, and I want you to understand also that you don't just become culturally competent and then you stop your learning. Culturally competent is the first step to the journey. And when we develop those skills around cultural competency, we then become more responsive. So we move into culturally responsiveness. Okay. So, but for the purpose of this study, it was really important that we just got the teachers to that first part, that first cultural competence stage, and then getting them to work towards being more culturally responsive. And another aspect or element that was really important in the framework. So all of these things, they work together, and that is around that we needed teachers needed to have a socio-political consciousness. So, and I guess, you know, being an EAL teacher, you know, in the work that you do and the work that I've done and I still do, we all have, and we can't do the work that we do if we don't have that socio-political consciousness in the EAL space. But it was really important that effective teachers who enact a culturally responsive pedagogy have those three elements. Another framework, I guess, or tool that I used in the study that I found really useful is Morrison and Robbins-Rose's synthesis of classroom-based research on culturally responsive pedagogy. So they gathered and pulled in research, global research, and through that they identified that the research showed there were three common strategies across the broad range of literature that they looked at or studies. So high academic expectations. So we saw that in the Gay's definition. Cultural competence and a critical consciousness. So within each of those strategies, they then identified these key elements that were critical. So I want you to think about some of those things. What are you know, you might already, some of these things are jumping out at you that are going to ring true to you, that you're actually doing already in your practice. And you might see some of these things that are already happening in the schools or the regions that you're working in, or you might identify teachers that are using a range of these key elements. And then what we're going to do later, we're going to explore this a little bit further. So we know through the current, I guess, discourse around education that teacher quality is high on the priority list, and you know, and building teacher capability is really critical to getting teacher quality. So the research that I looked at in the literature saw that there was actually a relationship between teacher quality and the attitudes and beliefs on student achievement. Okay. But also, there was also another element that saw that if students were going to be successful, okay, these are students with refugee background or migrant students were going to be successful and have a really good resettlement journey into the Australian context, that it was the teachers' attitudes and beliefs impacted on that. Okay. How the teachers saw these students, how these teachers enacted their pedagogies, okay? And it was also around their quality of teaching. So I needed to develop a professional learning intervention in order to start my study. So I needed to think about the literature around cultural competency, professional learning. So in order to help these teachers be culturally competent and work in culturally responsive ways, professional learning is critical, and it is as a vehicle to achieve that. So the literature in the field of professional learning proposes that formal and informal opportunities are necessary to challenge teachers' beliefs and attitudes. Okay. So learning and development opportunities also need to be designed to challenge and to change teacher practice for the betterment of students. So Gay calls this restructuring of teachers' attitudes and beliefs. So I needed to think about creating a professional learning intervention that really challenged teachers and also to challenge their beliefs and attitudes and ideas. We wanted to restructure their ideas, restructure their beliefs and their attitudes. And to do that, it really needed to be contextualized into that school context, and it had to be designed in a way that it could be sustained, that teachers could keep on with their learning journey, and it needed also to be collaborative. So the study was conducted in a state school in regional Far North Queensland. Teaching at the school actually requires teachers to work with large numbers of students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So at the time of the study, when the data was collected, the school had an enrolment of 677 students, with 70% of Indigenous and 73% English as an additional language or dialect. So included in this enrolment of the 677 students, 100 of those students were students from refugee background. And we were supporting them in the Intensive English Centre through a withdrawal model, and they were also back into classrooms in the mainstream classroom. So the study was based on 6 participants who engaged in this case study, and they were actually classroom teachers, and they were from a range of backgrounds with various levels of teaching experience. So the classroom teachers were actually chosen because teachers are actually the front line of teaching and the front line of change. So I really wanted to see the impact on the teacher practice. And, you know, we know what Hattie says, you know, around teachers and the importance of frontline teachers in the front line is that they have the most in-school impact on classroom success. So that was really important, that the study actually focused on the classroom teacher. So as part of my study, I was really required, participants were required to engage in a 5-week intervention. So if I go back here, we had a 5-week professional learning intervention, okay? And then 4 sessions of co-planning sessions. So they co-created an artifact. And then there were a series of data collection. We had a pre and post professional learning questionnaire that was done pre the professional learning and then after the professional learning. I had semi-structured interviews that were done prior to the intervention, the professional learning, then after the professional learning, and then after the co-planning sessions. So I needed to think about my professional learning intervention design because I needed to ensure that it was evidence-based. Okay, so I developed a framework to inform my design of my intervention. So my professional learning framework drawed on existing bodies of literature in the fields of cultural competency, culturally responsive pedagogy, anti-prejudice and anti-racism education and training. So I actually identified 6 strategies from the literature that were prominent as critical for the success for successful professional learning, for developing cultural competency in the workplace. And then you can see that in that slide. They were the 6 strategies that were seen as critical. So you can see that when I get to number 5, cultural competency, was broken down into 4 components. And all of this is interrelated. Right? And number 4, when we talk about no zone on culture, that it was knowing yourself and who you are and your own cultural background was really important to as an important step before we develop our own cultural competency. And you can actually see that professional learning needed to be reflective. We needed to have this cognitive dissonance embedded into the design of this intervention program. So let's look at our findings, because I'm sure that this is going to be of great interest. So I actually identified 3 stages or 3 themes that my findings fit in. So we had the cultural positions before the intervention. So what were the ideas or beliefs or values of the participants prior to before doing the intervention, and then looking at how those change after the intervention, and then looking at the teacher's learning trajectory after the co-planning interviews, and thinking about where to next, because as I stated, if you remember, that cultural competency is the first step on this journey, and that, we don't stop learning. We move towards culturally, from cultural competence to culturally responsive, and then we're going to move to culturally sustainable. So what is their learning trajectory? So let's have a look at their cultural positions prior to the intervention. So prior to the intervention, participants had no prior professional learning in how to work across cultures. So it actually really confirmed what the existing literature was already saying in the space of around professional learning and cultural competency. The teachers were female. So the 6 participants were female, they were middle-aged, and they were either Australian-born, and some were migrants. So about two were migrants, but they were all from the dominant white culture. Okay. While the sample was small, this is actually reflective of the demographics of the wider teaching profession, particularly in the area of which I was living in, or I am still living in. So while the participants came from a white dominant culture, they had very different set of values and expectations of schooling, okay? And they also had differences of life experiences and lived experiences. So they weren't a homogenous group by any means. They were a very diverse group of participants or teachers. And also, they were also, I believe, at that time, that they were actually at different stages of a continuum of cultural competency. Some were right at the beginning, some were sort of in the middle, and some were sort of, I would consider to be more culturally responsive and, in their practice. So it was a really nice group of a range of experiences, and everybody was on a very different journey. So it was a good sample. So if we just have a look here at one of at the participants, so we're just going to have a look at some of the, I guess, assumptions and ideas of what these participants came into the study before the intervention. So here's a snapshot, and we can see Maria, and we can have a look here at some of the key words that she's stating. I'll just give you a minute just to have a look and a read. So So her comment here illustrates that she perceives the behaviour of the students and the families as cultural. She does not really understand why they are behaving, why they're not behaving. She also sees the families and the communities they come from as not being cohesive. She is only seen at the surface level and not really learning about the student's background to understand them at a deeper level. She's making judgments based on her own values and beliefs, and we see her unconscious bias at play here. So if we go back to the other slides at the beginning that I showed you around the dominant narrative and discourse, we can see that Maria is having this culture of blame. Okay, so we can see that she's carrying this narrative. We can also see here another example of Ruth. I wonder what sort of narrative she holds. What does she hold a dominant narrative? What do you think? Here is Tara. Does she also hold a dominant narrative? We're going to go back to that slide in a minute, and then you can think about what aspect does she hold. And last of all, here we have this one here. You know, she's saying here, I'm not racist, but I'm not narrow-minded. But you know what I love about this here is towards the end, I can see, but I need a deeper understanding of how this is all going to fit together and how my views will need to change. So although this participant holds this dominant narrative, she sees that it's not working for her. It's not working in her practice. And so she's to the point where she's ready to change the way she views things, and she's ready to change her practice. And last of all, we can see here that Mia, well, she treats everybody the same because there's no difference. And she doesn't have issues with bullying because she treats everybody the same. And that, you know, probably works well for her. So if we go back to that slide that we had at the beginning, so let's unpack that just for a little bit. We can see that, you know, here Mia, she treats all the students the same. So she's just using, you know, how is this translated? Is she using her own cultural and social norms to treat all the students based on that? Okay. We see this, not everyone has a chance. It's up to them. So this culture of blame, not blaming the system. It's not the failure of the school. It's not the failure of the teacher, but it's, you know, here, it's the family, because the family don't love them. They're not giving them homework. Okay, there's a breakdown. It's the families because they're not, that she's making judgments on their parenting. And I wonder, in the work that you do, whether they are some of the narratives that you see or hear or experience in the schools that you work in. So moving on, after did the 5-week intervention, we saw a shift in their cultural positions. And when I looked at the data, I identified 2 major themes. One of them is that we all have an unconscious bias, and the other is that we all need to work towards cultural safety. So let's unpack. We all have an unconscious bias. So what I actually did was I actually identified three main manifestations or behaviors that the participants exhibited through the process of the intervention. And what was really important in this study was that this work around that you see here, colour blindness, a culture of problematizing and blame, and bad racists and the good non-racist binary, these kinds of concepts or behaviours are really, they actually provide insights to how teachers talk about race and culture, okay? And it is the first step in understanding why, okay, they make these pedagogical choices that are not useful for their students from culturally diverse backgrounds, right? So findings show that teachers demonstrate their unconscious bias when talking about race and culture, right? And then these were I guess, the three main ones that I identified. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, and I'm going to explain what those mean. So what I want to talk before I talk about this is this idea around racial stamina. So teachers require racial stamina. We all require this racial stamina when we work in cross-culturally, because we have to talk, we have to work in the space, and we always have to talk about race and culture, right? And we work that daily on the front line. So what is it? So racial stamina is the capacity to endure racial stress when talking about race and racism. And if we don't have that racial stamina, we see these behaviors in front of you exhibit in the workplace or in the classroom. And this then impacts the pedagogies or the choices that teachers make, okay, in the classroom. So through understanding and identifying and naming these manifestations of unconscious behaviours. So these are unconscious. We're not aware of all of this. It sort of manifests strangely in very awkward situations. But once we are aware of this and we identify these and we understand these behaviours, then we're better equipped to help ourselves when we're in these tricky and stressful situations. But we can also help other teachers to build their own racial stamina. So when I talk about so let's unpack this a bit. So we've got the we've got the bad racist and the good non-racist binary. So when we talk about this is Benson and D'Angelo, and they talk about this as, well, and really no one wants to be a racist. And as a collective, as a society, we're told that racists are bad people, and no one wants to be a bad person. And I'm a good person, so I can't be a racist, right? So if I'm having an unconscious bias thought, or I feel like I want to be a little bit racist, I'm going to, and I'm going to come back to this, I'm going to say, I'm not racist, I'm not narrow-minded. So I'm just reminding you that I'm a good person. I'm not racist, but, and then we can continue on with that unchecked dominant discourse that happens, that we hear so much in our community or in the school environment. So have a think about that. Do you do that? Have you seen it? Have you witnessed it? Yeah, it's very interesting. So here we go, color blindness. So we see here as an example, there is no bullying because there's no focus on difference. So there's no stereotyping. There's no focus on difference between people because I don't focus on the difference. Okay, she doesn't see color. So she's colorblind. Okay, but we know that when we work in the cross-cultural space, difference is really important. And when we identify difference, then we can have strategies and ways of working cross-culturally to work as cultural brokers. We can change our behaviour. We can monitor our behaviour between different cultural groups. Okay. Another aspect is the culture of problematizing and blame. And we saw that in here, where we're blaming the parents. Okay, we're blaming the parents and we're blaming the culture. It's got nothing to do with me. It's not the system. Okay, it's the dominant narrative. It's not a failure of the system, but the individual and the family. And so that then itself is one aspect of unconscious bias. So part of the process of the intervention was actually to help these teachers to unlearn all of this. And so by unlearning our existing thinking and acknowledging these unconscious biases, we can then examine how these impact our teaching practice and thereby make significant positive changes. But when teachers ignore this, they miss out on that connection and relationship building, which is really important aspect of cultural safety. So this study that I'm presenting today is not dissimilar to other studies that are identified, or other studies related to cultural competence or anti-racism. In fact, it really supports other research. So let's have a look at some of the comments that we see. We can start to see a real shift in this unlearning, okay, that I've talked about, you know, and remember when I said that Gay talks about professional learning needs to restructure teachers' beliefs and attitudes. Okay, so we can actually start to see some of this that's happening with the participants. I am shocked by my own perception. So this particular participant, I actually would have considered her, you know, on the culturally responsive end, not at the beginning of her journey. But we can see here, she still sees herself as still learning and still identifying that she has still so much to learn. And here we can actually see that she's been reflective and she's, you know, we can see that sustainability coming in and that self-reflection that was built into the professional learning, because she's saying, well, you know, I've got to really search for it. I have to reflect on it. I have to think about it. And here we have Maria, and she's really had this huge leap, a huge journey. And again, you know, I can't believe I didn't realize how biased. I didn't realize I was narrow-minded and that my biases impact on my everyday life. Okay, so we can actually start to see that restructuring of teacher attitudes and beliefs, that, you know, that shift in thinking. And again, if we look down towards the end of her statement, she's actually doing the self-reflection. You know, she's, you know, by understanding what you're looking at through a lens, a bias lens, you can stand back and go, okay, well, what's really going on here? You know, and I wonder if she's actually doing this in the classroom. You know, she could have exhibited some or experienced some racial stress in the classroom because some of her ideas were being challenged, some of her assumptions were being challenged. But now she's developed this racial stamina. She can reflect and reflection. She can think about, oh, hang on just a minute. I need to think about this. I need to stop and think about this. So we can see that, you know, there's this also this idea around on their learning is ongoing. There's no way they have, I guess, identified that they're finished, that there's still more work to be done. Another aspect that we looked at that the participants I also identified was that we all need to walk towards cultural safety. So teachers expressed the view that the school as an institution played a role in disenfranchising family engagement, and this resulted in a culture of blame that placed on families. So they've identified that they've had this dominant discourse, this dominant narrative, right? They've identified that they themselves have had this culture of blaming and problematizing. So we can see that they've identified that manifestation, that behavior, okay? And that they're starting to develop this racial stamina. So this actually meant that there was a failure in the effective cross-cultural communication, meaningful engagement between teachers and families, and the creation of a culturally safe environment. Teachers actually acknowledged the professional learning intervention provided opportunities to change their thinking about how teachers and schools position themselves and discuss how to change this. Teachers believed that the engagement with the school was the family responsibility prior to the study, prior to the intervention. However, this belief changed as teachers acknowledged that they needed to shift their existing power imbalance and their relationships between some of the students that they found challenging or problematic. And then they started to mend some of those relationships. Teachers identified that they need to change their approach and not only put the onus entirely on those families, but also they thought they needed to take responsibility. They identified that the professional learning and cultural competence can actually help teachers to realise and acknowledge their dominant position as a contributing factor to culturally unsafe classrooms. So if we look here, we can see Tara, and she's saying we really need to shift away from everything that happens in the school. She's identifying, we can see that she's using this meta language, and that there's a shifting of discourse here as she positions teachers as the dominant culture and acknowledges her responsibility in shifting that power and meeting families where they are at and not vice versa. So she's acknowledging her privilege as the barrier to having parents engaging in the school context. So by going into the community and meeting these families in their space, she's actually changing those power dynamics, whereby allowing families to feel safe, control and power, and therefore allowing herself to feel uncomfortable and challenged. So here again, she's developing this racial stamina, and she's really pushing herself to be and learning and being reflective. So she knows she's still got a lot to learn, and she's willing to push herself beyond. And here we see here when she says, well, they're uncomfortable, we're all uncomfortable, and it's not going to be productive. So if she's acknowledging that if we're going to work together and we're going to have these kids learning, having successful outcomes, we need to have cultural safety. That's paramount. And it's that discourse around it's the parents have to come and make those changes to fit into the school context. No. What she's saying is, I have to change the way I interact. I have to change myself to help those families to come into the school context. So we can see that position changing. And what I see here, it's this quote that really describes the participants in this study. It really describes how they've changed and what they're doing. Okay? So they're changing the dominant narrative and discourse. They're reflecting on their biases and acknowledging their privilege, and they're changing that power imbalance. And for many of these participants, although the study was really on students from a refugee background, but what I saw was that because there were more predominantly Indigenous students, there was a lot of mending of relationships with some of those families and some of those students. And so if we look at this definition or this quote, it says that cultural safety serves to mend relationships between the colonizers and the colonized. And that's what was happening in those classrooms for those participants. So after the intervention and those interviews, then we started to think about, well, what were we going to do in these planning sessions? What were we going to co-create? How are these participants going to use this theory? Because they did learn a lot of theory around culture and cultural competence. How are they going, and did a lot of reflection and a lot of unpacking, a lot of talking. How are they going to use that new information, their new lenses, their new thinking? How are they going to use that to create something that they could use in the classroom or to help, I guess, build capacity? We weren't really quite sure about what was going to happen. So what we did was, this is what they came up with. So here they created a framework, and this was co-constructed in the co-planning sessions. So it's actually a pedagogical framework for teachers to use when working across cultures. So it illustrates the realization about the impact of culture shock around newly arrived students' experiences. So one of the discussions that we had was the notion around, well, we had a lot of students, migrant students, we had a lot of new arrivals students coming in from other countries, but we also had a lot of Indigenous students coming in from remote areas and moving into town for various reasons. And what teachers identified was through the process of the intervention, that some of these behaviours that they saw as, and they used this culture of problematizing and blame, was actually culture shock. Okay, and they were exhibited in different ways. Okay, so here we've got students entering the school with cultural differences to that of the teacher. So there's this cultural difference. So then there's this culture shock coming into the school context. And then they wanted to talk about, well, what are our initial attitudes and beliefs? Well, we could go down 2 channels, and that's what they wanted to illustrate for themselves, but also to help other teachers to make those different choices. So this actual pedagogical framework shows that understanding that teachers have a choice in how they respond to students experiencing culture shock. This recognition shows that there's an understanding that any negative or perceived behaviours are a result of culture shock and adapting to a new culture. So as we saw in the case of Maria at the beginning of the intervention, this framework provides evidence that they're beginning to acknowledge their cultural, their unconscious bias comfortably. And this artifact represents a tool to remind them to keep changing their thinking. It also illustrates that there's this restructuring of the participants' thinking and attitudes. So remember, I talked about how professional learning needed to restructure teachers' thinking and attitudes and beliefs. Well, this actually shows or is evident, shows that this is evident that it can actually do this. So rather than changing the students and how the families respond, it is the teachers who can change and how they respond to difference. This is critical in addressing the power dynamics and the cultural differences in schooling. Participants wanted to be reminded of the different strategies of the culturally responsive pedagogy as illustrated by Morris, Robbins and Rose synthesis of classroom-based research on culturally responsive pedagogy. So as you can see, we actually did a lot of work around that, those strategies and those key elements, and we actually unpacked them, and they actually saw that as pretty important and really good reminder or a framework for them to help them think about their practice. So teachers wanted to create a framework because they felt that, you know, given that they had this workload, they wanted to have something that was explicitly displaying these strategies. Okay. And by having this visual, they felt that it would just reduce their cognitive load, because we know how busy teachers is. They wanted something that was on the wall that just reminded them to reset their thinking when they come into the classroom, or just to have to reflect on it during the day. And what I did was, after I had completed my research, I then employed a graphic designer to try to make it a little bit more user-friendly for the teachers, this tool. And this is what we came up with. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. So the teacher's learning trajectory. So remember I said that culturally responsive responsiveness, that we have, you know, you start off with being culturally competent, you're moving to culturally responsiveness, and then towards cultural sustainability. So it's this ongoing journey. So here we can see evidence that teachers are continuing on with this journey, or thinking about, I've still got a lot to learn. I've only learned this much and I've still got a long way to go. So, you know, that she's saying that she's aware of these biases, but now she's identified there's another group that she is suspicious and fearful about. And she says, because I don't know enough about them. So here she's actually saying, I need to know more. I need to find out more. She has a lot of more questions. So this is her trajectory. She's still learning and she's still developing. So if we look at this pedagogical framework, this really challenges the assumptions that if we have good intentions, then good teaching will follow. Good teachings, according to Benson, are problematic because when we act on good intentions, we do not really know if we are acting fairly. When research on unconscious bias makes it clear that our actions aren't always aligned with our intentions. In addition, Tipperley and Elton argue that good intentions are not enough to work effectively with students from cold backgrounds. And in this study, teachers identified that the effect on their own unconscious bias influences their choices of pedagogies. And pedagogical framework, which participants co-created, worked to position their thinking away from the good intentions and towards a more responsive approach that changed their practice. So they actually identified also that at the beginning they had good intentions, but when they went on this journey, they realized I had good intentions, but it's not enough. Okay? That I need to challenge these ideas. I need to do more work. So if I come back here, when we talk about these good intentions, that they're not enough. So let's have a look at this. See, here we've got our cultural differences. We have our students coming into the classroom space or the school. This is the culture shock. Okay, and that's going to be exhibited in many different ways. And students respond in very different ways. Okay, but then we come down to the teacher. And this is here. This is where I guess the front line is. And you know, it's no longer blaming the student or the families, it's up to us. So the teacher can make two choices. The teacher can show openness and trust through developing their culture and by being culturally responsive. Okay, so we're just going to focus just on this in a little bit here. So she's going to be observing, she's going to be listening, and she's going to be asking questions and inquiring. She's going to build those relationships, or he build those relationships with those students. And by doing that, it allows her to enact a culturally responsive pedagogy. Okay. If we are not culturally competent and we do have this biases and we continually don't engage in changing it or working it and checking ourselves all the time, we will never be able to enact in a culturally responsive pedagogy. And when we think about those outcomes, how does the students end up? Well, we know that sometimes there's behaviours exhibited, low academic achievement, disengagement. So when we see those behaviours in the classroom, we have to, I guess, think backwards. So if I'm seeing these, how am I responding? Am I criticizing them? Am I withdrawing and I'm not engaging enough? Then I've got to think about myself. Am I showing prejudice? Am I being suspicious? Am I being fearful? So if we go back all the way down, then we have to then change ourselves. And we have to, in order to do this culturally responsive pedagogy, we're going to have to do the hard work and do the work to change the way we see the world. We have to put a different lens over the work we do and how we see the students. And we know, you know, for some of you have seen these teachers and these practitioners, and some of you yourself are doing this, and, you know, you have this rapport. You have the rapport with the families, with the community, and with the students. Then there's this academic engagement, and we see students being successful in the school space. So what the study has identified that in the initial stages of cultural competency are somewhat theoretical and very basic level. So we did a lot of theory at a very basic level without really, and what we found out was some of those participants had also a very basic level of understanding and not really understanding what cultural competency was about. And throughout this intervention, participants engaged in theory and developed their own theoretical understanding. So this could be seen as the first stage of development of cultural competency. So it was really important that we gave those participants some theory, something to underpin the work, give them an understanding as to why we need to do the work, not the how, but it's the why. And that theoretical underpinning was critical to the work. So engaging in theory is the first step in assisting change. It gave teachers the meta language to explain and articulate what is going on. Planning for and allowing for white teachers, so I'm talking about the dominant group of teachers that we find in our schools, to engage in white fragility through carefully structured activities and discussions to create cognitive dissonance is critical in assisting to change and restructure existing behaviours and beliefs. That was really important. So that white fragility, those manifestations of behaviour of unconscious bias, we needed teachers to help them to think about that and identify that and to develop an understanding of those behaviours and why they behave the way they have or why they were thinking that. And we created that through cognitive dissonance. It is the design of the professional learning and providing the safe spaces for teachers to explore and learn these new ways of thinking is critical. Okay, so it was really pertinent that those groups were small. So, and we provided a cultural, it was cultural safety as well. So not only for the students that they were working in and helping them to realise to create culturally safe spaces in the classroom, but if we were to do professional learning in the culturally responsive space, then we needed to create culturally safe spaces for teachers to be able to develop their racial stamina. And it is through this process that teachers, so they can interrogate and they can adapt and adopt all these new knowledges. Also essential and pivotal to this are the opportunities for teachers to be able to and self-regulate their behaviour and thinking, and within a supportive group environment. So for teachers to enact a standard 1.3 of the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, they first must need to be able to be culturally competent and have a greater, deeper knowledge of culture and culturally responsive pedagogy. Also, to achieve cultural competency, teachers need to rethink or restructure their thinking and acknowledge their unconscious bias as a catalyst for change. So while I think I may have addressed, well, I believe I've addressed my research questions, I believe that it's actually opened up more questions, and perhaps we can explore this another time in your session, your live session we have in a couple of weeks. So I did my PhD a couple of years ago, well, 18 months ago I completed. So, you know, even though that this was the area of I researched, and by any means, I still feel I'm not an expert, and I still feel I'm learning and applying my new knowledge in different ways in the work that I do. And part of my role is to build capacity in the Indigenous EAL space across Queensland. So we have Indigenous EAL coaches in each region. And my role is to build their capacity to build up their teams and their schools. So I actually started to think about how I can do that work, how I can improve the work I do to help other teachers and educators. And in the work that I do, I always come across this statement, oh, it's just good teaching. It's just good teaching. And I always say, well, if it's just good teaching, then how come it's not done in the classroom already? How come we're not seeing it? And when we go back to the culturally responsive pedagogy, I believe that it's not just good teaching. As EAL teachers, you know, you come with your qualifications, you come with your lived experience, you come with your experiences, okay? You're highly skilled. You come with that kitty or bag of theory and of practice, all in there that you can draw on. Okay, so it's not just good teaching. It requires us to be culturally competent and culturally responsive. Okay, and I always say that that's the base. We cannot enact a curriculum. We cannot enact differentiation in a rigorous way if we're not culturally competent. That is critical. And so why I have an arrow on there is because I always, the work that I'm trying to do is to help teachers to understand, you know, second language learning and some of that little theory, some of the theory behind it. But I want them to have, they've got to have a lens over the top of that, because if they're not culturally responsible, working in that space, you know, working towards that space, how they view that theory is going to be very different. And so then how they enact that in their curriculum planning is going to look different. And then how they enact that differentiation and the strategies are going to be very different. Is it going to be enough for those EAL learners? And I would question that, and I would say, well, no, I don't think it's enough. I think we have to be working towards culturally responsiveness. So that's how I've applied my research, I guess, or my understandings, my new learnings in this space to the work that I do. So now it's your turn. So remembering this is in my diagram in the pedagogical framework that I showed you. After viewing this presentation, I'd like you to reflect first on some of your unconscious biases. Do you have any? What are your thoughts? Have they been challenged? Have they been affirmed? And then I want you to create this table and think about these key elements, and perhaps under each of these key elements to note down what you do in the work that you do. How do you do that? What are you doing in intensive modelling, scaffolding, clarification, and challenging curriculum? How are you enacting a high behavioural expectations? Are we doing critical literacy? What are some examples of what you do to enact that? What are some of your examples of reshaping the prescribed curriculum? What are some examples of you establishing relationships between school and the children's homes? So you could use it sort of like, I guess, an audit on your practice. And then once you've done that, then you'd be able to identify where your strengths are and where you probably perhaps would like to focus on in developing this pedagogy. Also, you might want to think about some of your colleagues. You know, are there colleagues that really stand out when you go into their classrooms or you go into the school? What is exactly that they do that makes them really successful, that makes them culturally responsive? And you can actually put those under those key elements. I think it would be great if you could bring some of your reflections and this to the online session, and maybe we have some time discussing this. You know, perhaps you maybe have a weakness or a lack of understanding in making explicit the power dynamics of the mainstream society in the work that you do. So by bringing that to light into the group, there may be other of your colleagues that are really strong in that and have some really lovely examples or strategies of how to enact that in their work that you can actually, that they may actually share with you. And maybe you can contribute something that you have strengthened, and you may actually help build capacity in another area. And I think that would be a really useful activity to do, to share some of your practice. So I've actually given you some recommended readings that maybe for you to think about. One is where this diagram here comes from. Okay, that's worth a read. But if you want an Australian context, Morrison, Rigney and Hatton and Diplock, Towards an Australian Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. But that also comes from an Indigenous perspective as well. So that's a really rich read, and it's very useful. Also, I would recommend Benson here, Unconscious Bias in Schools, and also Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. And these two authors, they identified white fragility in those manifestations or behaviours that we exhibit, or some of us exhibit when we are racially stressed, and they explain it a little bit more, and they actually have more examples of different ways that people exhibit white fragility. I actually found it very useful, and very good books to reflect on myself in my own growth around my own unconscious bias and my own journey towards working towards culturally responsiveness and cultural sustainability. And I'm still working on it, and I'm still learning. I'm still developing my racial stamina. It is a long journey. It's ongoing, and it's a really exciting journey to be on. You just have to be brave. You have to show, I guess, cultural humility and understand that some days and some situations you might not get it right, and that's okay. I all the time have to acknowledge my privilege in situations, and sometimes I get it wrong, and I have to go away and reflect and try to mend some of those situations to make it better. And each time I do it, I get better and better at doing it. Yeah, so I challenge you to challenge yourself in this space I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. I'm hoping that there are some gold nuggets here for you today that you can take away and think about. Maybe there's some things that you can implement in your practice, or maybe there's some tools here that will help you to build other colleagues' capability in this space. Maybe some of this work has really affirmed some of your thinking and ideas, and that's good too. And maybe you're at the beginning of your journey. But in any case, I really look forward to seeing you all online and hoping that, that you've got some questions. If you've got questions, please ask them, whether they are as challenging. You might think they're challenging, but I can say there's no dumb questions. We just have to make sure that the space we're in, it's safe to ask those questions, or if you've got any ideas to share, if we can spend some time on that, that would be great. And it would be useful, I think, for in your practice. So thank you very much and have a great day.